Night Vision. Following clues left by our ancestors, we unbury the past to reveal a knowledge of unfathomable value, putting us just a little closer to our own true birthrights. From the secret history of a possible bloodline of Jesus Christ, to secret history of America's founders, to the secret history of extraterrestrial interaction on our planet, here to bring light to the night. Your host for Night Vision Radio, Renee Barnett.
Hi, and welcome to the KGRA premiere of Night Vision, where we'll be chasing mysteries and untwisting history. I'm your host, Renee Barnett, and I look forward to uncovering hidden secrets of the past, which will hopefully inform us as we go forward into the future. But first things first, we'd like to wish everyone a happy Veterans Day today and recognize and thank all those who are serving or have served in our armed forces. Thank you so much for your service. We appreciate you and we need you. And talking about history, history's always written by the victors. And that sort of naturally gives us a rather slanted view of events in my way of thinking. And at Night Vision, we're going to read between the lines and uncover hard evidence of the real stories. And tonight, we're going to be taking a look into the true history of that mysterious order of warrior monks, the Knights Templar. But first, what's commonly known? Well, if you check Wikipedia, you will find that the Knights Templar were a Catholic military order founded in 1119, headquartered on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem through 1128. They were recognized in 1139 by papal bull, and the order was active until 1312, when it was perpetually suppressed by Pope Clement V. The Templars became a favored charity throughout Christendom and grew rapidly in membership and power. They were prominent in Christian finance. Templar Knights, in their distinctive white mantles with a red cross, were amongst the most skilled fighting units. Non-combatant members of the order, who made up as much as 90% of their members, managed a large economic infrastructure throughout Christendom. He developed many innovative financial techniques that were an early form of banking, building its own network of nearly 1,000 commanderies and fortifications across Europe and the Holy Land, arguably forming the world's first multinational corporation. The Templars were closely tied to the Crusades, and when the Holy Land was lost, support for the order faded. Rumors about the Templars' secret initiation ceremony created distrust, and King Philip IV of France, deeply in debt, I might say, to the order, took advantage of that distrust to destroy them and erase his own debt. In 1307, he had many of the order's members in France arrested, tortured into giving false confessions, and burned at the stake. Pope Clement V disbanded the order in 1312 under that pressure from King Philip, who of course owed them lots and lots of money. The abrupt reduction in power of a significant group in European society gave rise to speculation, legend, and legacy throughout the ages. And that brings me to my guest tonight, who is going to help us cut through some of that legend and speculation and get down to the real truth. And James Martin, among other things, among being one of my dear friends and cohorts, is a British historian, economist, and lecturer. As an historian, James believes that understanding the past is crucial to understanding our future, noting that evidence should guide us, but our minds should be open to ideas. James has previously worked in finance, employment law, and now is a lecturer and further in higher education. He has described himself as a history geek and a space nerd, and has dedicated a large portion of his more recent life into research into the Knights Templar, the Roman Empire, and the Western traditions of spirituality. The motto that guides James' research is GOYA, get off your arse. You notice I cleaned it up a little bit, James, which is why you're more likely to find him out in the field. And my most precious times in recent years have also been spent out in the field with James Martin, trooping around southern France and Scotland and northern England, looking for evidence of Templars and other interesting facts of history that may not be so well known. James, thank you so much for staying up late and joining us all the way from France.
Thank you for having me, and good evening, everyone. I thought what you said about the Knights Templar, just in the introduction, this idea that you've got an order that there is so much mystery, there's so much history about them, and the way that they've developed and where they came from and their origins. There is, no pressure in 55 minutes to try and get through all of that.
Exactly. But you know what? I did notice something. I was thinking when I grabbed that, I sort of truncated that Wikipedia article there and just hit some of the highlights. But as I was reading it the first time, I was thinking, okay, what is James going to contradict me on, on any of this? But one thing I did note in there that I thought you would certainly agree with, because we've spoken about this a lot, is that 90% of the order were not fighters, were not knights, were not warrior monks. They had all kinds of jobs. And I think those people never get any recognition, whereas, the Knights Templar are highly romanticized, and in many ways they should be. I love the history of the Knights Templar, but there are some unusual things that haven't really come to light about certain parts of its membership, about how they really started, about how they really ended up, and where they really went after that horrible Friday the 13th. We've got another Friday the 13th coming up this week, by the way. We should have done this show on Friday.
I think that's right. I think when we think of the Knights Templar, yes, it's okay for us to think about knights, but when we think of the Templars, most Templars were, I've invented a character called John the Dirt Shoveler. Although if you speak to me privately,
you cleaned that up too. Yeah, I noticed.
I don't call him the Dirt Shoveler, but it's the for each knight you had a retinue. You had heralders, you had men at arms. We're not just talking about just an order of people wandering around with swords, shields, and all of this. There really was a large infrastructure about the continent of Europe that were really supporting these knights when they were in the Middle East with food, horses, various provisions, money, and all of this. Now, the way that they organized themselves in those farms, fields, houses, and what have you is very interesting. It's certainly something that I don't think comes up enough. We have lots of stories of some of those workers from. You mentioned Friday the 13th. Well, what happened in France after the Templars were disbanded? I came across a story last year of one of those workers returning back to his preceptory, somewhere that we visited, Renee, to collect his pension from the Hospitaller. So the idea that there's a pension arrangement, I know quite a few people who don't even have one. But there we are. We've got a worker from a cooperative farm within the order going back to collect his pension in 1314.
That's interesting. And weren't they kind of known for creating the first checks? Because they would hold some collateral, and then a person would travel to the Holy Land or back, whichever way, and they would be able to collect on that note from the Knights Templar. In other words, it was just like a check.
Yeah, it was the
which was the first
traveler's check. Yeah, We're not really sure how they went about doing it. We know that they had a system, a presumably complicated system. Essentially, you could drop in at your, and I'm simplifying this, you could drop in at your local commandery, or let's de-weed. When we talk about commanderies, we're talking about the Knights Hospitaller. We should be using the term preceptory. There were preceptors, people who were in charge of a particular house, but you could drop into your preceptory, say that you were going on pilgrimage, and they would give you some sort of note, presumably with some sort of code, and there are some anecdotes of this. You would then end up at your final destination. You would go into the preceptory, or you would go into the travel agents, the Templar branch of Thomas Cook, or something like that, and you would exchange the note for the equivalent in gold. Really, the first traveller's checks, and this was really useful for a lot of the wealthy in society who at the time were travelling over on pilgrimage, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, about one of the potential reasons for the Templars being founded.
Right, and they didn't want to carry a lot of valuables with them, so because there were robbers on the road, which is one of the original stories about why the Templars were founded, although I think there are a lot of holes in that story as well. But, in that rather, kind of general reading from Wikipedia, it did mention this idea of, the king using rumors about the Templars in order to, get out of his own debt, in order to disband them so that he didn't have to basically pay them back, didn't have to repay his loans and debts to the order. But they talked about one of the big things was there were all these rumors about the secret initiation ceremonies. Can you go in to a little bit of what those rumors were, and what do we know today about what the ceremony actually was, if anything?
Well, it's a bit like the Roman Mithraic tradition. There's not really too much known. Most of what we know comes from torture, which means generally that it's not very reliable source information. There is an idea that they venerated the head of Baphomet, and I think most listeners who know about the Templars will have heard about this. Was it John the Baptist? To be honest, most of we must remember the Pope ended up absolving the Templars. So the rumours that they were engaging in homosexuality, let's be honest, there are anecdotes from the time of other orders where that was going on. It was seen in the context of the time as being so shocking that these people are depraved. Look, if we talk about John, our John the Dirt Shoveler, the Templars were a woven fabric within medieval society. And if you imagine the next day they're not there, or there's sudden scandal, it would be the equivalent of your bank the following day not existing. Not just the bank, but the financial system, the people that you've known, seeing around your town, village, it's gone. And if you just imagine that the level of shock and scandal to do so, they went with everything. Philip le Bel, Philip IV of France, really threw everything. Homosexuality, witchcraft, wizardry, the veneration of the devil, the veneration of the devil's head, you name it, anything you can think that's deprived, it was launched at them. And there isn't much evidence. Now, when we talk about...
Has there ever been any evidence that there was any head that was involved, and were they, in a lot of paintings, that are sort of involved in this sort of time, and in the region of southern France, and you often see, like Mary Magdalene, for instance, depicted with a skull. Was it a skull, or was there ever any head at all? Do we know?
It's probably the skull of John the Baptist, who, by European standards at the time, must have been some sort of hydra. There's something like 14 heads of John the Baptist across Europe. So, I can't say that I've seen a picture of him like that, but maybe one of your listeners could draw something. I think the head idea, it is perhaps an icon. I think it's something that they may have celebrated an idea of. I think the idea of the secrecy within the order comes from, well, their monastic origins. If you imagine if you're in your temple house and you've undertaken prayer, you eat in silence. Almost certainly there is a sort of sign language that develops, the practical things like, can you pass me the salt? You are not meant to talk, so how do you indicate that? Now, I think if anyone saw that from the outside, it would look very unusual. But I think there's also other elements. You've mentioned the finance. Well, we don't know what codes we used. We know that something existed that allowed people to exchange money, from place to place, but we don't understand the security. There was obviously some sort of code used. They were able to move money, produce, you name it, right over to the Middle East. There was a really advanced infrastructure. And I think if that order's then exposed and you have all of this scandal, then things that we might be able to say, well, they were just asking to pass the salt. It was a bit of sign language, might seem as being very, very unusual. I do think that there were a lot of secrets held by the Templars. I think a lot of what your show is about, which is looking at history, but looking at it in a way that it's the history that we've not all agreed on, to paraphrase Napoleon, that to really look at the what actually happened, and not to develop fantasy, but really to look at what evidence we've got. I think the head's there. I just want to make one other quick point. I think I just want to throw this in for the debate. Philip the Bell certainly owed quite a lot to the Templars, but I think that we should also look at his advisor, who was someone called Guillaume de Nogaret. Now, Guillaume was born in and grew up in a place called Saint-Félix, which is just near Toulouse, if any of you are looking at a map. Saint-Félix de Lauragais. And it is said that when he was around about 6 years old, he witnessed his mum, dad, and the rest of the villagers he grew up with being burnt alive because they believed in a slightly different variation of Christianity known as Catharism. It goes by some other names. And I think when you have a look at his story and his rise from very, very humble beginnings right up to the Chancellor of France, the person who's advising Philip the Bell, I'm almost convinced that he wanted to attack the Pope, who had declared a crusade against the Cathars, or the Albigensians as they were called, and he wanted vengeance. And I think the Templars were just in the way. They were the Pope's army.
That's an interesting point. But also, interestingly, I know a lot of people feel that the Templars were somehow whether not connected, but sympathetic to the Cathars.
Yeah.
So that sounds like a strange dichotomy, you know. There's the Pope's army.
Well, you've got the Pope's army, and you've got a very Catholic organization. If you pick up a history book, you'll read that. And you will also potentially read that there is no connection between the Cathars and the Templars. Well, I can say, when you look at evidence, me and you have stood above the graves of 2 Cathars in a Templar preceptory, well documented. There were connections with the Cathars, almost certainly in the south of France, where there is this idea of heresy, which, you know, if you break down what the word heresy actually means, you know, freedom of thought, where you had a lot of that going on in the south of France. The people who were working for the Templars almost certainly would have a range of religious views. So we can't say that there was no connection with the Cathars and the Templars. There were. Now, whether or not the central order would put up and tolerate with the Cathars is another thing. We've got to remember that a lot of the Templars in France, you know, based in the north, might not have had to deal with as many Cathars as those houses in the south. But we know that the Templars were working with the followers of Islam, Judaism in the Middle East. So we're talking about a hyper-Catholic order, but also one that is relatively tolerant, it seems, or at least worked with those of other faiths.
Do you think that's why they are part of the reason they were problematic, or do you think it was strictly financial on Philip's part?
It's a really good question. Personally, I believe that the Templars had something like 3 times Europe's GDP in terms of their treasury. And I personally believe that Philip le Bel thought he could see some of the treasure. There is an argument that he might have been looking for some artifacts that have been deposited in a house in the south of France from his granddad, someone called Saint Louis. But in a nutshell, my thoughts are the Templars were looking to establish an independent kingdom or republic in the south of France.
We've got some questions coming in from listeners already, so maybe I'll throw 1 or 2 at you here. Let's see. Blue Orb today asks, what is the meaning of their symbolic 2 knights on 1 horse?
Hi, Blue Orb today. It's a really good question. So the symbology behind that is when the order was established, they were established, give them their full name, the Poor Knights of Christ of the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. The idea was that they were following Bernard of Clairvaux, a Cistercian. You can't escape the Cistercians when you're looking at the Templars, but they were very poor. They were meant to lead austere lives. And the idea was that you had 2 people on the horse instead of 1 to show how much poverty they were in. Now, they weren't in poverty, as you know, we've just discussed, but that was the symbology behind it, that they couldn't afford a horse each. That was the
Poor Knights, yeah.
Yeah, the Poor Knights, yes.
That's funny. I'm getting a hard time in the chat here with Bill, our producer, because fortunately I'm not so slow that I didn't figure it out before he actually messaged me. But that message was from Blue Orb, not Blue Orb today. That's just part of the.
I'm sorry,
the next
Blue Orb,
one I see is also last name of today. So Bill is saying, "Don't mention today." That's coming from a chat post. He's laughing at me there on the other end. That's so funny. I'll get used to it, Bill. This is day 1. Anyhow, that's funny. But yeah, that is very familiar symbol that we see often when we're hearing about the Knights Templar, and certainly when you're down there in the region of Southwest France, those symbols are everywhere, in every souvenir shop, for sure. I know you have some, and I have some as well. But now let's see. Let me ask now. I'm not going to add the today on. And John, okay, I'm going to try to pronounce your last name, John. Forgive me. I would pronounce it Ostanis, but is it Ostanes or Ostanis? John Ostanis said, was there any truth to the worst heresy accusations? Actually, this is a couple questions. Did the Templars survive by transforming into another order, secret society, or fraternity? Ooh, now that's a big question. Which I don't know if we'll have time for all that. But certainly,
yes.
Was there any truth to the worst heresy accusations? What would those have been?
That's a very good point, because what we would consider as being ridiculous, they would treat seriously. There were anecdotes of sodomy, as they referred to it. There certainly was, but the only evidence I've seen is 3 examples, and again, it's confession under torture. So I know that 2 people ended up leaving for what we would call Germany today. The worshipping of heads, again under torture. There were some admissions. They really came back on those admissions after they had been tortured. There may have been some evidence, but look, we're talking about an order that was transcontinental, for ranging at one point from the Middle East right the way through to Scotland and Ireland. I don't want to generalize by saying all Templars did this, because of course there's going to be examples of some heretical ideas, but they're not as common as we might be led to believe if we believe what the Inquisition had to say. And your other question is a really good one. I'm just going to try and keep it as succinct as possible. The Templars did survive, yes. They survived in Spain, and they survived in Portugal. They transformed themselves into, in Portugal, the Order of Christ. And there's some brilliant letter writing between the King of Portugal, who is appalled that the Templars have been disbanded, because the Templars in Portugal and Spain were battling the Moors, or the followers of Islam, that were occupying the Spanish peninsula. So the idea that you would get rid of their number one fighting force midway through what's called the Reconquista, the reconquest of the Iberian, the Spanish, Portuguese peninsula, midway through that was ridiculous. And there's the letters that are going between, I think it was King Alfonso and the then Pope, about this is ridiculous. Well, they end up in a nutshell just changing the name of them from the Templars to the Order of Christ in Scotland. One of the problems for the French monarchy was, once the Templars had been disbanded, you end up in a period of different families jostling for the French crown. Well, you had the Garde de la Cosse, the Scots Guard, who was seen as impartial. And a lot of Templar families, a lot of names that you'd be familiar with, the Sinclairs, for example, ended up defending and protecting, being the personal bodyguard of the French crown up until Mary, Queen of Scots, and her mother, around that period. So yeah, of course they continued, they transformed, if you wish. I actually don't think in a lot of occasions they transformed, they just changed the name.
You hear also that some of the Templars went up into Scotland and kind of joined in with the Cistercians. Do you find that to be true? Or I know some of your recent findings have definitely put them in Spain and Portugal, but were they spread out to other countries as well?
Absolutely. If you imagine England and Scotland and Ireland is the sort of retirement home for the Templars, yes, there are many temple houses in England and in Scotland too, potentially getting as far up as Aberdeen and as far west as Argyll. I've certainly uncovered a number of very I was going to say unusual. A lot of Templar iconography, symbols in Argyll and around the islands there. Yes, generally what happens to the Templars, if they're not in Spain or Portugal, some of them end up going and joining the Teutonic Knights, who are up in today's Poland and a bit of Germany, up in the Baltic. Some end up joining the Hospitaller. Some end up retreating and retiring into monasteries. So, yeah, there's all of the above, Renee.
You know, it might be a good time to remind our listeners that you are listening to Night Vision. I'm Renee Barnett, your host, and my guest tonight is James Martin. We're talking about the Knights Templar, and you are listening to KGRAradio.com. Let's see. We've got ERRT Radio says, are the Templars more religious, as in Catholic, or more spiritual, like as in witchcraft? So I guess like paganism. Well, they were a religious order.
They certainly are a religious order. I would suggest certainly a spiritual one too. Let me just take you back to the foundation of the order, if I can. So you might ask when the order was established, and I'll come clean with you and say I don't know. Let me explain. The Templars didn't leave much by the way of written record. Other orders did. So a lot of what we know about the Templars were things that were written about them. You essentially, if you didn't like the idea of the Knights Templar, you might have a less favourable thing to say. But I've just taken 3 extracts. So I was just reminding myself of some of my research and writings. 3 people. You've got Bishop Anselm of Havelberg, and he writes in 1150, and he says that the order was established around about 1096, 1099 by Pope Urban II, who gave the approval for the order following the First Crusade. The monk, Richard of Poitou, who was an abbot at a place called Cluny, who was writing in 1153, he says that they were established around 1109, when one of his fellow brothers, Hugh of Cluny, died in 1109. But he then contradicts himself and says, oh, actually, it was 1108 when Louis VI became King of France. And the last person was Otto of Freising, who was writing between 1143 and 1147, says that they were founded in 1122. What this means is the confusion of dates from people who were around at the time. It says that people in Western Europe didn't really notice the establishment of the new order when they were established in 1118, 1120, 1096. Now, the reason I've mentioned that is because there is someone who goes about popularizing the Templars, and he's a reformist, and he's known as Bernard of Fontaine, or you might know him as Bernard of Clairvaux. Mm-hmm. And he publicizes the order. Let me quote him. Richard of Poitou says, there are some who say, had it not been for them, the Knights Templar, the Franks would have lost Jerusalem and Palestine long ago. So there's a lot of PR going on. But the way that Bernard had organised his own religious order, the Cistercians, they weren't in individual houses like other orders, but they were connected. You had a series of daughter houses and a mother house, and the abbots from those daughter houses would travel to a general chapter, a bit like a board meeting of executives in a business today. What Bernard was doing was interesting. He joins an order, reforms it. He's from very wealthy origins, and he travels around Europe promoting the Templars, his own order, to the point that he puts the Cistercians and the Templars on the map. With that in mind, some of the spiritual ideas of the Templar order, when they are in the Middle East, looking at, I don't know, some of the influences of Judaism, looking at some of the influences of a very ancient part of the world, there are certainly some examples of spiritual practice within the order. So again, if we're saying they're a very conservative Catholic order, we also have to take in mind that there are bits of evidence out there that suggest a much more spiritual, I don't want to say pagan, but certainly a lot more by way of belief in toleration, for example, of looking after fellow man. Last point on that, just another example. You might think of the Templars as being crusaders. Let me just say, they were established about 20 years after the Crusades, and they really didn't like the idea of knights. I know that sounds weird because we call them the Knights Templar, but what I mean by this is, the idea is that you've got, let me quote Bernard again. The duty of a knight was to kill his enemies and fight in the name of his Lord. The duty of a Christian was to love his neighbour as himself and to turn the other cheek when confronted with aggression. Now, there's a contradiction there, and this is where the more spiritual side comes in. Bernard doesn't want, when he's sponsoring the Knights Templar in those early days, just another group of knights who are killing machines, because he believes that goes against his God and the belief of God at the time. Instead, he sees the Templars as being a way of escaping the evils of the military, and one that can further the cause of God. And it's interesting because he doesn't necessarily mention the word church. Now, if you just take a step back and look, well, wow, there's an order that's founded to look after each other, to be noble. We get the term chivalry really from this period, which just means, it's from the French chevalier, which means horse rider, essentially. Mm-hmm. Here we have this great spiritualist notion of looking after one another. We could probably do with the Templars today in that way.
We sure could. You mentioned how, naturally, since they were in the Middle East, that they were, possibly influenced and open to ideas of the Jewish traditions and possibly even Islamic traditions in the area. But wasn't there, and this is what is confusing, I think, they were a Christian order, they were a Catholic order, but wasn't there, and haven't you uncovered a Jewish element to the Knights Templar?
Yeah, there's some land that is donated in this area of France from which I'm speaking to you, around Carcassonne, that was donated by, one tract of land by some Jewish brothers, one by 3 Jewish brothers. I actually have signatures of the transfer deeds. Now, whether or not they're transferring for some sort of protection, whether it's some, I haven't ruled out, is it some sort of tax avoidance scheme or something like that? But again, it's just this idea that, the Jews had nothing to do with the Templars. I actually have a different view, which is I actually think quite a lot of the Templars were Jewish.
Well, that's sort of what I'm getting at. And why do you say that? Well,
you're in the Middle East. You would certainly have to work with a lot of the 3 Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. They are founded, certainly the houses in the south of France, which has at the time a very large Jewish population. The notion that Jews were excluded. You've also got. I suppose we're getting into the esoteric nature of it. Some of the numerology, the symbology that the Templars use are very Judaic. Now there is out there, there's speculation about some family connections between some of the principal Templar knights. Whether or not we'll ever prove them, I don't know. But what I can say is, tracts of land that were owned by Jews were given to the order. And in fact, one place, that was where they established one of their preceptories.
I remember, going across in Alet-Laban and coming across that area that was, obviously a Jewish area, and being sort of surprised by that, because we don't hear much about any Jewish element in that part of history. And it just seems that if you start looking at the documents, the archives, the academic archives that you have access to, you can sort of pick up those threads and see these connections that have not been quite so obvious to everyone.
Well, to the medieval eye, those following the Jewish faith, there are some horrendous attacks against people who just believe in something different at the time. Really quite horrendous forms of persecution. There are others, though, like Bernard of Clairvaux, like, in fact, some of the popes. I was reading Celestine VI during the Black Death, who said, please stop blaming the Jews for the Black Death. It wasn't them. They're being affected like us. Christians at the time, I don't know, a sort of split view on things, which is, we shouldn't kill Jewish people. We shouldn't expel them because they remind us of what they did to Christ. Now, I'm not a subscriber to that argument. That's certainly one of the arguments that was around at the time. Jews were traders. Their origins tied directly in with Pharaonic, the pharaohs of Egypt. We know that they had, they had a very ancient culture, still do. And working with them, when you're in the Middle East and you're working, and in the south of France, and you're working with traders who are supporting your efforts in the Holy Land, for example, it almost goes without question that some of that ancient wisdom, could have been transferred over to that order.
Yeah. ERRT Radio has a follow-up question, and it's a doozy. What happened to all the Templar treasures?
It's in my attic, but don't tell anyone, will you, please? Good question. Some of it could have got smelted down. Alaric the Goth, who sacked Rome and took the menorah from the temple, could have melted it down. A lot of it could still be underground. Some of it, I'm open to the idea, could have been moved to different parts of the world. What did happen to it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's been a lot of rumors and legends that, some of the treasures of the temple were brought down to southwest France. There's been rumors about the Ark of the Covenant, the Great Menorah, and other items, ceremonial items being in the area. Of course, we've heard also the story of the Ark of the Covenant being taken down to Ethiopia as well. But it's interesting that these items, continue to be, so sought after, and have been throughout the centuries. I mean, the Nazis were, in a great search for all those items, and including the Sword of Destiny and the Ark of the Covenant and all those. That's why they sent the young Otto Rahn to the area to look for those treasures. That's another interesting story.
A homosexual Jewish Nazi looking for Templar treasure. I think if anyone is expecting that, if someone says to you, here's a sword, it's Templar, it's owned by a Grand Master, run in the other direction. However, I do know of hoards. Some colleagues of mine have been involved in Belgium, for example, about 5 or 6 years ago. I actually have some of the coins from that, and I will just argue legally with provenance, but some coins from a hoard buried by Templars from a nearby house. Unfortunately, I can't give you the exact location due to the concerns of the farm owner, who started to receive some very unusual visitors, and we'll leave that one there. But certainly these were basic coins from the time of Philip IV. Where did the rest of it go? It's a good question. I don't think the treasures of the Templar are actually gold. I think the treasures of the Templars originate in what I said earlier, which is a very old belief in looking after each other. And I think that a lot of the families that began, I mean, the order started off really with either 7 or 9 or perhaps 11, or as Martin the Syrian suggests, Michael the Syrian, suggests there could have been 31 original knights. The point is, a lot of very aristocratic families ended up joining the order, and those people have a lot of very interesting family traditions that could have bled in. You can certainly see some of the arguments for the Jesus bloodline, and I know, Renee, you've done a feature film essentially on this. Well, I think if you're going to get a metal detector out and then start looking for the Templars, you're doing it the wrong way around. Yeah,
I think so too. I got another question from chat. Another question from John Ostanis, and I'm apologizing if I'm butchering your name. Does Mr. Martin? It's Dr. Martin, actually, but he doesn't like for me to say that. So I will say, does James Martin think Masonry has any claim to carrying on the Templar tradition? That's part one of the question. And part two, what books or other resources would you suggest for studying Templar history?
Great question. Yes, I do think, from what I've just clarify, I'm not a Mason, but I do know that a lot of the traditions that Masons undertake, they don't know why they do it. I think that there is a continuation, and I can hear some Mason friends wincing at me saying that, but I do think there is some continuation. I think it's not just Masonry, though. I think you can have a look, as I say, at the Order of Christ in Portugal, which still exists. You could look at the Order of Malta, and of Cyprus, and of St. James, and, we could carry on. Yes, I think there's quite a few branches carrying on the Templar tradition. I think the other question was what books or resources. In a nutshell, Dr. Tim Wallace Murphy's work on the Templars and the Western esoteric tradition are superb and will certainly open your eyes. Professor Helen Nicholson, I would recommend also, who takes a different view on the Templars. But for me, I would suggest Tim Wallace Murphy, yes.
Absolutely. Who did not also did not like to be called doctor.
No.
So there you go. Like father, like son, basically. Yes, Tim Wallace
As above,
Murphy.
so below, Renee.
Yep. Was a dear friend. And, I do have to say that the last couple of years of his life, James, along with two other fine young gentlemen, took care of Tim. And we got to spend some good time with him during the last years of his life. And so we miss him. We love him. But we're going to be bringing more of Tim's work forward into the future. In fact, there's going to be some things coming up on KGRA that involved Dr. James Martin and myself, to a lesser extent, I must say. I believe there may be a series coming forward on the Knights Templar. We also may be taking a look into the life and legacy of Dr. Tim Wallace Murphy and some other interesting things going forward. So we're excited to bring those things to you. And also, I'd like to encourage people to let me know if there's a subject that you'd like for us to cover on Night Vision, and or a suggested guest. We're going to be, largely focused on history. And there's a history to everything. So that's what we're going to be doing. I'll be looking forward to your suggestions in the future. But yeah, those are some good books. Also, I should say that you're going to be releasing a book at some point. You've been working on that map marking Templar sites, some of them sort of heretofore unknown. And you're going to be writing something to go along with that and releasing that. And I think that'll be a very, very good place for people to start, get an idea of the scope of the order and the reach that they had in maybe a few of the facts versus some of the fiction. But
it's essentially a reverse history. So going from today backwards, looking at the what happened to the Templars afterwards, but where did they come from too? And the map that you refer to, yes, I've spent the past nearly 4 years mapping every Templar site in Europe. There's quite a bit more work to do, but I'm closer to finishing than beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're looking forward to that, and what else might be coming forward from you that I can't, I'm not at liberty to speak at great length about, but just keep watching KGRA website in the coming weeks, and you might get some nice surprises. But gosh, we're coming toward the end of the show here, and I want to thank everybody for indulging me on my very first broadcast on KGRA. Night Vision has been around for a while, but I took about a year or so off on hiatus, and I wanted to make sure I found the right place to go and the right family to hook up with, and I believe that I found it, and I want to thank KGRA for giving me this opportunity to indulge myself into some of my most favorite subjects and to chat with some of my best friends and favorite authors and researchers. and make some new friends along the way as well. So I want to thank everyone for listening. And next week, I want to advise you that my guest will be Court Lindell, and he's going to be bringing us back to the New World, and we're going to be chasing after that elusive Beale treasure. I know that's a very popular subject among a lot of people, all you treasure hunters out there. So he's got some interesting takes on that subject, and we might get into a few other things while we're at it. But James, thank you so much for being my very first guest. You made it so easy for me. I knew you would.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for some of the really good, great questions, everyone. Keep safe, and thank you for having me on, Renee.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Keep listening to KTRAradio.com.